Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku's quirk let him replay any moment, but only once per day. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The feeling was a familiar phantom. It lived in the hollow space behind his ribs, a quiet thrum of potential that had no name and no outlet. For 10 years, since that sterile doctor's office and the X-ray of his two-jointed pinky toe, Izuku Midoriya had been told he was a blank page in a world filled with vibrant, chaotic ink. Quirkless, a mundane noun in a world of superpowered verbs, and yet, the feeling persisted. It was like a word caught on the tip of his tongue, a melody he half remembered from a dream. Sometimes, when he was sketching a new hero in his notebook, his fingers would twitch with an energy that wasn't just excitement. When he watched footage of All Might, a resonant hum would vibrate deep in his bones, an echo answering a call. He tried to coax it out, of course. For years, he'd stood in front of his mirror, eyes squeezed shut, trying to move his All Might figurine with his mind, trying to breathe a tiny puff of fire, trying to do anything. Nothing ever happened. Eventually, he dismissed it as the desperate delusion of a boy who wanted to be a hero more than he wanted to breathe. It was just a ghost, the shadow of a dream. Today, that ghost felt particularly restless. The school day had been a masterpiece of mundanity and misery. The teacher had casually outed his UA application, opening the floodgates for the usual symphony of snickers. And then there was Kaken. "Don't even think of applying to UA, you damn nerd." The words still echoed in his ears, punctuated by the sharp, acrid smell of burnt sugar from the explosion that had scorched his notebook. The notebook he now clutched to his chest like a shield. Deku. Useless. A name given in mockery, a brand seared into his identity. He took the long way home, tracing a path under a gloomy underpass, the concrete cool and damp around him. If you want to be a hero so bad, there's a quick way to do it. Believe that you'll have a quirk in your next life and take a swan dive off the roof. Kaken's voice was a venomous whisper in his memory. Izuku's shoulders slumped. He knew Kaken didn't really mean it. It was just Kaken, all sharp edges and explosive rage, a human grenade whose pin was his own pride. Still, the word stung, burrowing into the soft, vulnerable parts of him he tried so hard to protect. He was so lost in his thoughts, in the familiar spiral of self-pity and hero worship, that he didn't hear the gurgling, sloshing sound until it was too late. A medium-sized invisibility cloak. A wet, guttural voice rasped from the sewer grate behind him. Izuku froze, his blood turning to ice. He turned slowly, his backpack slipping from his sweaty fingers. A monstrous, amorphous being of green, viscous sludge was pouring from the manhole, two huge, manic eyes swimming in the semi-liquid mass. It was a villain. A real, live villain. Here, panic, cold and absolute, seized him. His mind, usually a rapid-fire catalogue of hero facts and quirk analyses, went completely blank. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The villain lunged, a tidal wave of filth and malice. "Don't worry. I'm just taking over your body. It'll be easier for both of us if you don't fight back." The villain gurgled, its voice thick and suffocating. "It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds. The sludge enveloped him. It was a nightmare made real. It was cold, thick, and utterly suffocating. It forced its way into his mouth, his nose, a horrifying violation that stole his breath and burned his lungs. His limbs thrashed uselessly, finding no purchase in the shifting goo. He clawed at the mass, his fingers sinking into the foul substance, trying to pull it away, but it was like trying to fight the ocean. His vision began to tunnel, black spots dancing at the edges. "I'm dying," he thought, a detached sword of terror washing over him. "I'm going to die here. In a tunnel. Smelling like a sewer." Suddenly, the sewer grate behind them clanged, blasted open by an impossible force. "Have no fear, for I am here." The voice was like a thunderclap, a divine pronouncement that shattered the villain's hold. Izuku felt a gust of wind, a hurricane contained in a single motion. Texas smash! The pressure vanished. The sludge was blown away, splattered against the concrete walls in an instant. Izuku collapsed to the ground, gasping, coughing, his body heaving as he dragged precious, clean air into his burning lungs. He looked up, his vision blurry with tears, and saw him, the silhouette that had dominated his entire existence. Broad shoulders, a statuesque frame, and two iconic tufts of blonde hair, like a rabbit's ears. All Might, the number one hero, was there, scooping the splattered remains of the villain into a soda bottle. Izuku's brain rebooted, the fanboy overwhelming the trauma victim. He scrambled for his notebook, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen. An autograph. He needed an autograph. The next few minutes were a blur of awestruck muttering and frantic hero worship that ended with Izuku making the most reckless decision of his life, clinging to All Might's leg as he leaped into the sky. It led to a crash landing on a rooftop, a deflated and skeletal man, and a secret that shook the foundations of Izuku's world. All Might, the symbol of peace, was wounded, his time limit dwindling, and then came the words that were worse than any villain's attack. "It's not bad to dream. But you have to be realistic, kid." All Might left him there on the roof, the words echoing in the empty space where his dreams used to be. The phantom feeling behind his ribs was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy stone. It was over. The doctor had been right. Kaken had been right. All Might had been right. It was time to give up. As he trudged down the stairs and back onto the streets, the distant sound of an explosion snapped him out of his daze. Smoke plumed in the sky from a familiar shopping district. A villain attack. He felt a detached curiosity, the automatic pull of a lifelong habit, and his feet carried him toward the chaos. When he arrived, the scene was horrifyingly familiar. The same sludge villain, now free from the bottle All Might must have dropped, had found a new hostage. A crowd was gathered, held back by the pro-heroes on the scene. Death Arms was trying to land a punch, but his fist sank uselessly into the slime. Kamui Woods couldn't act for fear of the fires. Backdraft was busy containing the flames. No one had the right quirk. And then Izuku saw who was trapped inside the swirling green prison. Spiky blonde hair. Red, terrified eyes. Explosions erupting futilely from his hands, only serving to spread the fires. It was Kaken. "This is my fault," the thought screamed through Izuku's mind. If he hadn't clung to All Might, the villain would still be in his pocket. If he hadn't been so selfish, Kaken wouldn't be suffocating. He watched, frozen, as the other heroes stood by, waiting for someone with a more suitable quirk. He saw the desperation in Kaken's eyes. It wasn't the usual look of rage or arrogance. It was pure, primal fear. It was the look of someone drowning. And in that moment, Izuku saw not his tormentor, not his rival, but a person who needed help. He didn't know why his legs moved. He didn't make a conscious decision. One moment he was a paralyzed spectator in the crowd, the next he was sprinting past the police line, a scarecrow of a boy running toward a monster. "No, you idiot! Stop!" Death Arms yelled. Izuku didn't listen. His mind was a blank slate of terror, but his body was operating on a single, desperate instinct. What would a hero do? His gaze fell on his yellow backpack. It wasn't much. It was nothing, but it was something. He swung it off his shoulder and hurled it at the villain. The canvas bag, heavy with textbooks, flew through the air in a clumsy arc. It struck the villain's massive form with a wet thwack. One of the villain's huge, gelatinous eyes swiveled to him, momentarily distracted. It wasn't enough. The small opening he'd created was useless. He was just a quirkless kid with a backpack. He started clawing at the sludge, trying to dig Kaken out, his fingers slipping on the viscous surface. "What the hell are you doing, Deku?" Bakugo choked out, his voice hoarse. "I don't know." Izuku screamed back, tears streaming down his face. "My legs just started moving. I couldn't just stand there and watch you die." The villain's attention, which had been focused on subduing Bakugo, now turned entirely to the new, more fragile nuisance. "You again!" It gurgled, its voice dripping with rage. The sludge that held Bakugo shifted, and a massive tendril of green ooze shot out, not to capture Izuku, but to strike him. It moved faster than anything Izuku had ever seen. He saw it coming, a green fist of death. He saw the shock on Bakugo's face. He saw the heroes starting to move, but they were too far away, too slow. He even saw a blur of motion at the edge of his vision, A flash of blue and red, but it was a lifetime away. A fraction of a second too late. There was no time to dodge. No time to scream. There was only a single, all-consuming thought that burned brighter than any fear. No. Not like this. Let me do that again. Let me do it right. The world ended, not in fire or darkness, but in a violent, sickening lurch. It was as if the universe was a film reel that had suddenly snagged, shredded, and was now being wound backward at an impossible, nauseating speed. Colors bled into one another. Sounds compressed into a high-pitched whine that drilled into his skull. The feeling of the impending impact, a phantom pain that hadn't even happened yet, ghosted over his skin. The suffocating memory of the underpass returned, thick and cloying in his throat. His brain felt like it was being squeezed through a sieve, and then it stopped. Izuku was standing on the street corner, behind the police line. His heart was a jackhammer against his ribs. A wave of vertigo so intense it buckled his knees threatened to send him to the pavement. A migraine exploded behind his eyes, a starburst of pure agony. He gasped for air, his hand flying to his throat. He could still feel the sludge. He could still feel the phantom pressure of the villain's blow that never landed. He coughed, a dry, racking sound, but his lungs were clear. He looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. The crowd was still shouting. The fires were still burning. Death Arms was still yelling. "We can't get close. Someone with the right quirk will be here any minute." It was the exact same moment. He was back. Back to seconds before he had started running. What was that? His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A hallucination brought on by stress? A premonition? But it had felt too real. The pain in his head was real. The ghost of suffocation was real. The memory was seared into his brain not like a dream, but like a lived experience. He remembered every detail. The arc of his backpack, the villain's momentary distraction, the rage in its eyes, the killing blow, the blur of All Might arriving a heartbeat too late. He looked at the scene again. At Kaken, struggling for his life. The same terror was in his eyes. The heroes were still helpless. Nothing had changed. Except for him. He now possessed a piece of impossible knowledge. He had seen the future. He had lived through a failed attempt. He knew what didn't work. The backpack, he thought, his mind latching onto the one variable he could control. He hadn't just thrown it. He had hit the villain. He'd seen its eye swivel. An eye. A weak point. His analysis in the first take, the one that had been cut short by his death, was now a weapon. No, let me do it right. His own thought echoed back to him. The desperate wish. The phantom thrum behind his ribs, which had been a dull stone moments ago, now sparked with a terrifying, vibrant energy. This was it. This was the ghost he'd been chasing his whole life. It wasn't telekinesis or fire breathing. It was this. A second chance. He didn't have time to process the earth-shattering implications. The scene was playing out exactly as before. Kaken let out another desperate, choked explosion. The look in his eyes was growing dimmer. This time, when Izuku's legs moved, it wasn't just mindless instinct. It was instinct guided by memory, by the ghost of a failure only he knew. He burst from the crowd, a green-haired missile of pure intent. "Get back here, you fool!" a hero yelled. He ignored them. His path was a straight line, his focus absolute. He swung his backpack off his shoulder, his movements fluid and certain. He wasn't just throwing it this time. He was aiming. He twisted his body, putting all of his meager weight into the throw, just like a baseball pitcher he'd analyzed for a hero notebook once. The yellow backpack became a blur. It didn't just whack against the villain's body. It sailed in a perfect, precise arc and struck the villain squarely in its dominant, central eye. The sound was a sickening squelch. The villain roared, a sound of pure agony that the first, clumsy throw hadn't elicited. Its entire form convulsed, its grip on Bakugo loosening for a critical second as its gelatinous hands flew to its injured eye. It was a real opening. Not a momentary distraction, but a genuine window of opportunity born from impossible foresight. Bakugo, freed for a precious instant, coughed, dragging a ragged breath into his lungs. "Deku?" Izuku didn't stop. He was already there, clawing at the sludge around Bakugo's face, his movements frantic but purposeful. "Hold on, Kaken!" And then, the world shook. A shadow fell over them, and a presence that radiated power and hope landed just behind the villain. "I really am pathetic," All Might's voice boomed, though it was tinged with self-reproach. Izuku didn't need to look. He knew. This time, he wasn't too late. The opening Izuku had created, the single second he had bought with his impossible knowledge, had been enough. Detroit. Smash! The wind pressure was cataclysmic. It tore the villain to shreds, scattering it into harmless droplets. The force of the blow was so immense that the very air seemed to part, and the sky began to change. Dark clouds broke apart. Rain began to fall, extinguishing the fires and washing the grime from the street. The crowd erupted into cheers. Izuku was on his hands and knees, panting, the adrenaline leaving him weak and shaky. The migraine was still pounding a merciless rhythm against his skull. Bakugo was a few feet away, also on the ground, coughing but alive. He was alive. Afterward, the scolding came, just as he remembered. The pro-heroes admonished him for his recklessness, for his foolishness. But this time, the words barely registered. He was in a daze, his reality fundamentally fractured. He had died. He was sure of it. And now he was here, being lectured for a success born from that death. Bakugo stalked over to him before the paramedics could check him over. His face was a thunderous mask of confusion and fury. "I didn't need you to save me!" he snarled, his voice raw. He paused, his crimson eyes narrowing. The usual script of their interactions felt wrong. There was a question burning behind the anger. How did you know to throw it there?" "At its eye?" he bit out, the words low and sharp. "There's no way you could have seen that from the crowd." "Don't lie to me, Deku." Izuku stared back, his mind a blank. What could he possibly say? "Oh, well, in the first timeline, my clumsy throw just pissed it off and it killed me, but I got a do-over and remembered its weak point. He would be sent to a psychiatric ward. I don't know," he stammered, which was the honest-to-God truth. He didn't know how. He only knew the what. Bakugo scoffed, unconvinced. The look he gave Izuku wasn't the usual dismissal of a worthless pebble. It was the suspicious glare one gives a puzzle they can't solve. He turned and walked away, leaving Izuku to his throbbing head and the weight of his impossible secret. Izuku was turning to leave, to disappear back into the crowd and try to make sense of the last 10 minutes of his life, when a familiar voice stopped him cold. "I am here." He turned. All Might, in his towering, muscular form, stood before him, blocking his path. "All Might, what are you doing here?" Izuku asked, his voice barely a whisper. He expected another lecture, another dose of crushing realism. "I came to thank you, and to apologize," All Might said, his signature smile in place, but his eyes holding a serious, analytical light. "But now I also have a question." Izuku braced himself. "What you did back there, young man?" All Might began, his voice lower now, for there is only. "It was reckless and foolish, yes. You ran into a fight you had no hope of winning. That is the truth." He leaned in slightly. "However, the moment you threw that bag, that was not just a desperate act. I was watching. From the moment you left the crowd to the moment you threw it was less than 3 seconds. In that time, you analyzed the villain's anatomy, pinpointed its primary weak point, and executed a throw with a precision that would make a pro-hero proud. That wasn't just instinct. That was impossible." Izuku's breath hitched. All Might had seen it. He hadn't just seen a brave kid. He'd seen the impossible result of the rewind. I. Izuku stuttered, his mind racing for a plausible lie. There wasn't one. All Might held up a hand. "Young man, all my life I have been told that heroes show their true colors in moments of crisis. Many of the greatest heroes have stories like this. Their bodies moved before they could think." He looked down at Izuku, his blue eyes piercing. "Your body moved, yes? But your mind moved faster. I saw the look on your face. You were not just a boy running on instinct. You were a soldier executing a plan. Tell me, son. What is your quirk?" The question hung in the air, heavy and damning. Izuku's world tilted on its axis. He had a quirk. He actually had a quirk. And it had just been witnessed by the #1 hero. But how could he explain it? I'm quirkless, he mumbled, the lie feeling hollow and absurd on his tongue. He held up his foot as if to show the joint. The doctors, everyone said. All Might's smile didn't falter, but it became something more knowing. Quirks can manifest late, especially under extreme stress. And some quirks are subtle. They are not always brute strength or flashy powers. Some are intuitive. An analytical ability that works faster than conscious thought, perhaps? A hyper-instinct that gives you a flash of insight? He was offering Izuku an out, a plausible explanation. Izuku could only stare, dumbfounded. It was then that All Might's posture seemed to soften, the grand persona of the symbol of peace melting away to reveal the man beneath. You, a boy who everyone believed to be quirkless, were the only one who acted. You spurred me to act. You possess something more important than any power. He placed a heavy hand on Izuku's shoulder. Young man, you too can become a hero. The words. They were the same words he had begged to hear on the rooftop, but this time they were different. They weren't an indulgence. They were an observation, a conclusion drawn from evidence he had unknowingly provided. Tears welled in Izuku's eyes, hot and sudden, blurring the image of his idol. I deem you worthy of my power, All Might declared, his voice resonating with a historic gravity. My quirk is yours to inherit. He explained everything then. The sacred torch passed from user to user. One for all. A quirk that stockpiled power, a crystallized form of courage and strength. He was offering Izuku the sun, just after Izuku had discovered he could bend starlight. The walk home was a disorienting journey through a world that was no longer the one he had woken up in. His head still ached with the ghost of the rewind, a deep, pulsating throb that felt lodged in his very soul. His hand kept drifting to his throat, a subconscious check for a threat that was long gone, but whose phantom sensation remained. He had two quirks. One was a legacy, a gift from his hero, a power so immense it would shatter his body if he wasn't careful. It was a future he had to build. The other was a secret. A terrifying, unknown variable that had saved his life and Kaken's. It was a past he had rewritten. He had died. The memory was not fading. It was a cold, hard stone in his gut. He remembered the darkness. He remembered the split second of All Might's failure. It was a truth that only he would ever know, a private horror film playing on a loop in the back of his mind. He had used his quirk, without even knowing he had one. It had activated on a desperate wish, a plea for a single do-over. He stumbled into his apartment, his mother's worried questions washing over him. He gave her a weak, edited version of the truth, a villain, a close call. All Might had saved him. He ate dinner in a daze, the taste of the food muted, his senses still overwhelmed by the phantom sludge and the psychic agony of the rewind. Later, lying in his bed, staring at the All Might poster on his ceiling, he tried to summon the feeling again. He squeezed his eyes shut, focusing on the moment before he'd spilled a glass of water on his desk. Let me do that again. He pleaded with the universe, with the strange new energy inside him. Nothing happened. The thrumming potential was quiet, dormant. It felt spent. Like a battery that had been completely drained. A horrifying thought began to coalesce in his mind. What if it was only once? What if he only got one shot at redemption per day? Per lifetime? The thought was terrifying. This wasn't some convenient video game power. It was a burden. A single, precious, agonizing second chance. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, his mind replayed the lunge of the sludge villain. The feeling of his bones about to break. The darkness. The failure. He felt the phantom suffocation one last time, a cold reminder of the price of his new power. He had stepped onto the path of a hero, but he was already haunted by the ghosts of the mistakes he had been allowed to erase. Today was the first day of his new life, and it had begun with his own death. This was his first second. And he was terrified of what the next would bring. The morning after was a study in gray. The sky outside Izuku's window was the color of dishwater, and a dull, persistent throbbing echoed the gloom from inside his own skull. It wasn't the explosive agony of the previous day, but a weary, Residual ache, a physical ghost of the psychic violence his quirk had inflicted upon him. He had woken up 3 times during the night, each time drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of sludge filling his throat. Death was a surprisingly sticky memory. He sat at his desk, staring at the crisp, new workout plan All Might had emailed him. The American Dream Plan. It was audacious, overwhelming, and the single most wonderful thing he had ever seen. It was a tangible path forward, a promise written in exercise regimens and dietary guidelines. Yet, as he traced the schedule with his finger, his mind was elsewhere. It was fixated on the other power, the secret one. One more time. He had decided on a name for it in the sleepless hours of the night. It felt simple, direct, and captured the desperate plea that had activated it. He had relived the moment of its use 100 times, trying to dissect it like a scientist. The trigger wasn't just wanting a do-over. He'd wanted do-overs his entire life. It was the confluence of 3 things: absolute, life-or-death desperation, a crystal-clear image of the moment he wanted to return to, and a singular, burning wish that overpowered every other thought. Let me do it right. The problem was the exhaustion. The power had left him feeling drained. Not just physically, but spiritually. That quiet, humming potential he'd felt his whole life, the ghost in his machine, was silent. It felt like an empty well. He had tried again last night, focusing on a dropped pencil, trying to rewind a few seconds. Nothing. Not a flicker. This confirmed his terrifying theory. It was a limited resource. Once a day? Once every 24 hours? He had no way of knowing for sure, but the feeling of utter depletion was undeniable. His first official meeting with All Might for training was at 5 in the morning, at the Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. The place was a tragedy. Once a beautiful coastline, it was now an illegal dumping ground, a mountain range of rusted appliances, forgotten furniture, and mountains of trash, all slowly being reclaimed by the sea. The salt spray mixed with the smell of decay. All Might, in his skeletal form, was waiting for him, looking surprisingly at home amidst the junk. "Good morning, young Midoriya," he said, his voice a reedy version of its usual boom. "Behold, your gym for the next 10 months, Izuku's jaw dropped. "All of this? I have to move, all of this, that's right," All Might said with a grin, which looked more like a grimace on his gaunt face. "You see, most of the wannabes who apply to UE these days think a flashy quirk is all it takes. They neglect the fundamentals. A trained body is the only vessel that can properly wield great power. Right now, your body is an unfit vessel. If you were to inherit one for all as you are, your limbs would fly right off." The image was so cartoonishly gruesome that Izuku paled. "My limbs would fly off, Pop!" All Might gestured with a flourish. "Clean off. So, we must rebuild you from the ground up. This isn't just physical training, my boy. This is an act of community service. A hero cleanses more than just the streets of villains," and so it began. The 10 months were a blur of grueling, back-breaking labor. Izuku's life became a simple, repeating cycle: wake before dawn, haul trash, go to school in a semi-conscious daze, come home, study, collapse into bed. The American Dream Plan was relentless. Weeks bled into months. The sun rose and set over the junkyard beach, casting long shadows that looked like grasping monsters. Izuku learned the protest of every muscle in his body. He learned the particular agony of rope burn, the dull ache of a strained back, the sharp sting of sliced hands. Throughout it all, he experimented. Cautiously. He couldn't risk another full-blown activation. The memory of the vertigo and the blinding headache was a potent deterrent. But he had to understand the mechanics. He had to know his own power. During one particularly frustrating afternoon in the 3rd month, he was trying to secure a bundle of rusted pipes with a frayed rope. He pulled it taut, and with a dry snap, the rope gave way. The pipes clattered down the pile of junk, undoing 10 minutes of careful work. Damn it! Go back! He thought, frustration flaring hot in his chest. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to replicate the intensity of the sludge villain incident. He focused on the moment before the rope snapped. Nothing. The pipes lay where they had fallen. The phantom hum inside him remained silent. He tried again a week later when he tripped over a discarded engine block, tumbling face first into a pile of rotting tatami mats. The fall was jarring, humiliating. Go back, he pleaded inwardly. Again nothing. He was left with a bruised ego and the smell of mildew. He slowly began to piece it together. Frustration wasn't enough. Annoyance wasn't enough. It had to be a primal, overwhelming emotion. The kind of terror that strips you down to your barest survival instinct. He hoped he would never have to feel that way again, which created a horrifying paradox. The only way to truly master his quirk was to be in situations he would do anything to avoid. He also confirmed the time limit. He started a journal, hidden inside his hero analysis notebooks. Day 1, post-sludge villain Quirk feels completely drained. No response. Day 2, still nothing. Headache is finally gone. Day 3, a faint flicker. Like a pilot light trying to catch. Still no activation possible. It seemed to take a full 48 to 72 hours for the well to refill, and even then, it felt weak. He came to a grim conclusion. Once a day was optimistic. It was more like once every few days, and only if his life was on the line. This power was not a tool. It was a panic button. A single-use ejector seat. By the 8th month, things had changed. Izuku was no longer the scrawny, scarecrow-like boy who had started. His frame had filled out with lean, hard-won muscle. He could now haul refrigerators on his back without his spine screaming in protest. He had cleared a massive swath of the beach, revealing a sliver of clean, golden sand that the morning sun now kissed, and he could feel it. One for all. It wasn't a part of him yet, but since All Might had given him a strand of his hair to ingest a few weeks prior, he could feel its power humming under his skin. It was a caged sun, a terrifying, exhilarating ocean of energy that he could just barely touch. One evening, All Might had to leave early for some hero business. Izuku was left alone on the beach as dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. He stood before a particularly monstrous piece of junk, an old, industrial-sized refrigerator, its door hanging off one hinge like a broken jaw. He had been trying to move it all day. He looked down at his own hands, now calloused and strong. He could feel the raw power of one for all tingling in his limbs, a low-level electrical current. I can do this, he thought. He wanted to prove it, to himself more than anyone. He wanted to feel the power, just once, before the entrance exam. Clench your butt cheeks and scream smash from the bottom of your heart. All Might's unique advice echoed in his head. He took a deep breath, planting his feet in the sand. He focused on his right arm, trying to draw that ocean of power into it. He felt it surge, far stronger and more volatile than he anticipated. It was a wildfire, not a controlled burn. Red-black energy, like angry veins, crackled up his arm. He reared back to punch the refrigerator. And in that split second, a cold, analytical part of his brain, the part that wrote his notebooks, screamed a warning. This is too much. You're not ready. Your arm isn't strong enough to be a cannon. He felt it a millisecond before it happened, a sickening, internal pop deep within the bones of his forearm. A surge of white-hot, searing pain erupted from his elbow to his knuckles. He saw, in his mind's eye, his bones turning to powder, his muscles tearing from their anchors. His arm was about to become a useless, shattered ruin. Panic, pure and absolute, eclipsed the pain. This wasn't just an injury. This was the end of the dream. He couldn't take the UE exam with a shattered arm. He couldn't become a hero. All the work, all the sweat and pain of the last 8 months, gone in one stupid, arrogant moment. No! Stop! Go back! The thought wasn't a wish. It was a command screamed by his soul. The world shattered. The vertigo was even worse this time, a nauseating, head-spinning plunge through a kaleidoscope of shredded reality. The sound was a physical thing, a screech of tearing metal and breaking glass that existed only in his head. He felt the phantom agony of his arm disintegrating, a memory of pain for an event that was being unhappened. It was 1,000 times more intense than the sludge villain rewind. He found himself standing 10 feet away from the refrigerator, his right arm held protectively against his chest. His body had remembered the danger and had moved on its own. The rewind had only taken him back about 10 seconds. His arm was whole, intact. But the ghost of the shattering agony was so real he could barely breathe. He collapsed to his knees in the sand, dry heaving. The world was tilting on a greasy, unstable axis. The horizon sloshed back and forth like water in a bowl. The headache was instantaneous and blinding, a railroad spike being driven through his temple. His quirk, one more time, had worked. It had saved him from his own stupidity. But the cost was immense. He felt weak, sick, and utterly spent. The phantom hum inside him was gone, replaced by a cavernous, silent void. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, his head in his hands, waiting for the world to stop spinning. The cool evening air felt clammy against his skin. "Young Midoriya? Are you all right?" Izuku flinched, looking up. All Might had returned, his skeletal form silhouetted against the dying light. His face was etched with concern. "You're pale as a sheet, my boy. Did you overdo it?" Izuku's mind raced. He couldn't tell him the truth. He couldn't explain that he just used a secret, time-bending quirk to save himself from shattering his arm with the very power All Might had entrusted to him. The shame was a hot flush on his cheeks. "Yeah, just pushed myself too hard," Izuku lied, his voice hoarse. "I think I'm just exhausted. Didn't eat enough today, maybe." It was a flimsy excuse, but All Might seemed to accept it, though his worried frown deepened. "I see. Well, your progress has been phenomenal. Perhaps a day of rest is in order. Go home, my boy. Get some sleep. A hero needs to know his limits." The irony was a bitter pill. He had just brutally learned his limits, erased the lesson with a cosmic cheat code, and was now suffering the consequences in secret. He nodded weakly, gathered his things, and began the long, shaky walk home. Every step was a battle against the rolling waves of nausea. The headache pounded in time with his footsteps. This quirk, it wasn't a gift. It was a debt. And the interest rate was agony. He made it home and collapsed into bed, skipping dinner despite his mother's worried calls. He fell into a fitful, feverish sleep, haunted by the feeling of his own bones breaking. The next day, the physical side effects had faded to a dull throb and a lingering wooziness. He felt fragile, like a piece of cracked glass that might shatter with the slightest nudge. The well of his secret quirk was bone dry. He knew, with an instinctual certainty, that he was completely powerless. He had used his one-time miracle for the day. Or for the next few days. He was walking home from school, taking a quiet residential side street to avoid the crowds. His thoughts were a tangled mess, replaying his foolishness on the beach. He had used his quirk to fix a personal mistake. A stupid, avoidable mistake born from impatience. It felt like a profound waste, a squandering of something sacred. What if a real crisis had happened right after? What if a villain had attacked? As if summoned by the thought, a flash of red caught his eye. A small, red rubber ball bounced out from behind a parked car and into the street. A moment later, a little boy, no older than 5, chased after it, his face alight with the single-minded joy of a child at play. Simultaneously, a white delivery truck whipped around the blind corner at the end of the street, moving far too fast. The world slowed to a crawl. Izuku saw it all in a horrifying tableau. The boy, oblivious, reaching for his ball. The truck driver, his face just beginning to register the danger. The boy's mother on the sidewalk, her head down, looking at her phone, completely unaware. There were maybe 3 seconds until impact. Izuku's entire being screamed. His first, most primal instinct was to use his power. Rewind! Go back! Put the boy back on the sidewalk. He reached for it. He reached for that feeling, that internal trigger, that emergency button. He focused on the moment before the ball rolled into the street, his mind screaming the command, and he felt nothing, a dead circuit. An empty well. The desperate reach for power found only a hollow echo. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. I can't. I already used it. He had spent his single, precious miracle on saving his own arm from his own mistake. And now, a child was about to die, and his ultimate safety net was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through him. There was no time for regret. There was no time for a do-over. There was only now. There was only what he, Izuku Midoriya, could do with his own 2 feet. He broke into a desperate sprint. The 10 months of hellish training took over. His legs pumped, eating up the asphalt. He was faster than he'd ever been, but the truck was faster still. The screech of tires filled the air as the driver finally slammed on the brakes. Izuku didn't think. He acted. He launched himself forward in a clumsy, sprawling dive, his arms outstretched. He shoved the little boy as hard as he could, sending him tumbling back toward the safety of the curb. He wasn't fast enough to get himself clear. The bumper of the truck clipped his side, a glancing blow that was still powerful enough to send him spinning through the air. He landed hard on the pavement, his shoulder and hip taking the brunt of the impact. Pain, sharp and immediate, flared through his body. The world was a dizzying blur of asphalt and sky. The truck skidded to a halt inches from where he lay. The air was filled with the smell of burning rubber and the sound of the mother's horrified scream, finally having looked up from her phone. Izuku pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. His side was on fire, his shoulder felt like it had been dislocated, and road rash scraped his arms raw. But he was alive. He looked over. The boy was crying, but he was safe, scrambling back to his hysterical mother. He had done it. He had saved him. The normal way. Messy, painful, and terrifyingly close. He staggered to the curb and sat down hard, his head buzzing. The mother was rushing over, alternating between hugging her son and trying to thank Izuku, her words a jumbled mess of sobs and relief. The truck driver stumbled out, pale and shaking. Izuku barely heard them. He was staring at his own trembling, scraped hands. The victory felt hollow, overshadowed by a terrifying, monumental realization. He had used his godlike power to prevent a self-inflicted training injury. He had prioritized the perfection of his own journey, the pristine narrative of his training, over the potential need to save a life. Because he had been unwilling to face the consequences of his own mistake, a broken arm and a delay in his dream, he had been left with nothing when a real life was on the line. He had nearly failed, not because he was weak, but because he had been careless with his one true miracle. This quirk wasn't a tool for erasing his personal failures. It wasn't a safety net to ensure he never stumbled. It was a strategic asset of unimaginable value, and he had treated it like a spare coin for a vending machine. The cost of his desire for a perfect training run had almost been a child's life. As he finally limped home, refusing medical attention and waving off the grateful mother, the lesson settled deep in his bones, colder and heavier than any phantom feeling. Every morning, he would wake up with a single, terrible choice in his pocket. A choice of what to save. A choice of which failure was acceptable. He could not be perfect. He could not save everyone from everything. He could only carry the weight of his own mistakes, his own broken bones, his own pain, to save his one shot for a moment when it truly mattered, a moment when there was no other way. He looked at his bruised and scraped body in the mirror that night. These injuries were real. They would heal. But the memory of his failure in the first timeline with the sludge villain, the ghost of his shattered arm on the beach, and the horrifying image of the truck bearing down on the little boy, those were injuries of a different kind. And he was the only one who had to carry them. The cost of perfection was far too high. From now on, he would aim not for perfection, but for survival, for their survival, not his. The gates of Yue High School were even more imposing in person. They loomed over him, a grand archway of glass and steel that seemed to separate the mundane world from the world of heroes. For 10 years, this place had been a distant, shimmering mirage, the pinnacle of his dreams. Now, he was walking through its gates, a legitimate student. The sheer unreality of it was a dizzying sensation, almost as potent as the aftershocks of his quirk. He had passed the entrance exam. It had been a chaotic, terrifying whirlwind of screeching metal and crumbling concrete. He'd frozen at first, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the mock city and the casual, destructive power of the other examinees. He saw them racking up points, blasting and smashing robots with practiced ease, while he stood there, a statue of anxiety. He had been on the verge of total failure. Then he'd seen her. The girl with the kind eyes and the pink cheeks, trapped under a piece of rubble with the colossal zero-pointer bearing down on her. In that moment, there had been no hesitation. He hadn't even considered using one more time. The lesson of the truck and the little boy was still a fresh, raw wound in his mind. This was a test, not a life-or-death crisis. He had to rely on himself, so he had. He channeled one for all, the caged sun inside him, and leaped. The resulting smash had been cataclysmic, a punch that had turned the zero-pointer into a cascade of scrap metal and shattered both his legs and his right arm. It was agonizing, but it had been his power, his choice. He hadn't cheated. He hadn't erased the pain. He had earned his place, broken bones and all. Now, healed by Recovery Girl but still feeling the phantom ache of the damage, he searched for Class 1A. The door was ridiculously oversized, a clear statement about the larger-than-life students it was built for. Taking a deep breath, he slid it open and was immediately greeted by the sight of Kaken locked in a verbal sparring match with a tall, rigidly formal boy with glasses. Some things never changed. The first day was a blur of introductions and orientations. He reunited with the kind girl, Uraraka Achiko, and the formal boy, Ida Tenya. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was among peers, friends even. The feeling was as foreign and wonderful as the quirk humming in his bones. And then, their homeroom teacher arrived, emerging from a yellow sleeping bag on the floor like a particularly grumpy butterfly. Shota Aizawa, the pro-hero Eraserhead, was not what Izuku had expected. His tired eyes, which seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights, swept over the class with an air of profound disappointment. "It took you 8 seconds to quiet down," Aizawa said, his voice a monotone drone. "That's not going to work. Time is a precious resource. You lot aren't rational enough." He directed them to change into their gym uniforms and meet him on the field. There was no welcome ceremony, no friendly orientation. Only a stark, immediate challenge. "A quirk apprehension test," Aizawa announced to the assembled class, his gaze lingering on Izuku for a fraction of a second longer than the others. "You've been taking standardized tests without your quirks your whole lives. This country still insists on pretending we're all created equal. It's not rational. Today, you will use your quirks to show me your true potential." He tossed a softball to Bakugo. "Bakugo, you finished first in the entrance exam. What was your best softball throw in middle school?" 67 meters. Bakugo grunted. "Try it with your quirk." Bakugo grinned, a feral, shark-like expression. He wound up, and with a thunderous explosion and a scream of "Die!" launched the ball into the stratosphere. It landed a staggering 705.2 meters away. The class erupted in excited murmurs. "This looks so fun," someone said. Aizawa's expression soured. "Fun? You think this is fun?" The air grew cold. "You have 3 years here to become heroes. You think it's all going to be games and fun? Unbelievable." His lips curled into a grim smile. "All right. New rule. The student who ranks last in total points will be judged to have no potential, and will be expelled immediately." A wave of panic washed over the class. Izuku felt his stomach plummet. Expelled? On the first day? This wasn't a test, it was a culling. He looked down at his own hands. He still had no control over One for All. Using it at full power would break his bones. Using a fraction of it was a guessing game he hadn't even begun to figure out. He was at a massive, terrifying disadvantage. The phantom hum inside him, the presence of One More Time, was a quiet but steady thrum. It had been days since he'd used it on the beach. The well was full. The power was there, a coiled serpent waiting in the back of his mind. A tiny, insidious thought whispered to him. You could use it. You could see the outcome of each test, and then rewind to get the perfect score. He pushed the thought away, his heart pounding. No. That wasn't the purpose. He had to save it. The test began, and Izuku's performance was, to put it mildly, pathetic. 50-meter dash, 7.02 seconds. He was painfully average, afraid to use One for All for fear of shattering his legs on the first step. He watched Ida's engines propel him across the finish line in a blur and Bakugo use his explosions for a rocket-like burst of speed. Grip strength, he managed a decent 56 kilograms, but that was nothing compared to the 8-armed Shoji, who crushed the meter. Standing long jump, he landed squarely in the sandpit, A perfectly normal jump that felt like a colossal failure next to Uraraka, who could have floated across the entire field, or the frog-like Tsuyu Azui. With each subsequent test, his ranking dropped. He saw the pitying looks from his new classmates, the sneer on Bakugo's face, the cold, calculating neutrality in Aizawa's eyes. He was falling behind fast. The threat of expulsion felt less like a possibility, and more like an impending, unavoidable doom. Finally, they came to the last event, the ball throw. This was it. This was his last chance. All the other tests had been about speed or raw, explosive power over short distances. This was about a single, focused burst. He could do this. He had to. He stepped up to the circle, the soft ball feeling heavy and slick in his sweaty palm. The weight of everyone's gaze was a physical pressure. He could feel Aizawa's intense stare boring into him. Okay, Izuku. Focus. Not 100%. Just a little. Enough to get a decent score. Channel it into your fingertip, like at the entrance exam. He took a deep breath, reared back, and threw. He tried to summon just a flicker of one for all, a tiny spark from the raging inferno within. He felt a faint tingle, a whisper of power, but it fizzled out before it could do anything. The ball flew from his hand with a pathetic lack of force. It landed a few feet in front of him with a soft thud. 46 meters. Silence. The field was utterly, deathly silent. Izuku stared at the pathetic result on Aizawa's device. 46 meters. It was worse than his middle school record. It was a complete and utter failure. Aizawa sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. I was wondering about you, Midoriya, he said, his voice flat. He looked up, and his hair began to float, his eyes glowing a menacing red. His capture weapon writhed around his neck. I erased your quirk, Izuku gasped. Erasure. Of course. That's why the power had fizzled. That entrance exam was certainly not rational. A person like you, who would cripple himself for a single act of heroism, is of no use in the field, Aizawa stated, pulling Izuku toward him with his capture weapon until they were face to face. The proximity was terrifying. You intend to break your bones again? To be saved by someone else every time you use your power? To be a one-trick pony who becomes useless after a single attack? And no! That's not what Izuku stammered. Regardless of your intentions, that would be the reality. Aizawa cut him off, his red eyes unwavering. You have no control. You have no potential beyond that one suicidal burst, and I will not allow a liability into my class. He released him, the red glow fading from his eyes. I've returned your quirk. You have one more throw. Get it done. He walked back to his spot, his message clear. This wasn't just about getting a good score. This was about showing him something else. Showing him control. Showing him potential beyond self-destruction. Izuku stood in the circle, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The pressure was immense. The entire class was watching. His dream of being a hero, of attending UA, hung in the balance of this one throw. Failure meant expulsion. Failure meant going back to being the quirkless, useless Deku everyone thought he was, and the temptation screamed. It was a siren song, a sweet, logical whisper in the hurricane of his panic. One more time. The power was there, coiled and ready. He could feel its presence, a cool, calm pool in the middle of his frantic terror. He could throw the ball, see what happened. If he broke his arm, if the score wasn't good enough, if he failed, he could just rewind. He could go back to this exact moment, armed with the knowledge of what not to do. He could try again, tweak the power output, adjust his form. He could guarantee a perfect throw. He could show Aizawa a score that would blow him away, proving his potential beyond a shadow of a doubt. He could erase this humiliating failure and replace it with a flawless victory. He closed his eyes, visualizing it. He saw the world lurching, the sounds compressing, the feeling of vertigo. He saw himself standing here again, but this time with a serene confidence, knowing exactly how much power to use. It was so easy. One thought. One desperate wish. Let me do it right. He was on the verge of activating it. His entire being strained toward the release, toward the safety of a second chance. But then, Another voice cut through the panic. A memory. All Might's voice, weary and wise. A hero needs to know his limits, and his own realization, bought with bruises and the near death of a child. It's a strategic asset. Not a crutch. He opened his eyes and looked at Aizawa. The man's face was a mask of stern neutrality, but Izuku saw something else in his posture. This wasn't just about the numbers. Aizawa had seen his recklessness in the entrance exam. He was testing Izuku's rationality, his ability to think under pressure. Would a perfect, impossible score truly prove that, or would it just look like another uncontrolled, lucky fluke? What if a villain attacked the school this afternoon? The thought was cold and sobering. What if someone got hurt during a training exercise in an hour? If he used his one shot now, on a grade, on his own pride, he would be powerless. He would be forced to stand by, just like he had been on the street with the truck, holding an empty hand. Was saving his spot at Yui worth that risk? Was his dream more important than a potential life? The answer was a painful, resounding no. He made a choice. It was a terrifying choice, a gamble with his entire future. He would face this challenge as he was. He would not use his rewind. He would not erase this moment of pressure. He would prove his worth not with a perfect do-over, but by showing that he could think, adapt, and control himself, even with his limitations. He would build on his failure, not erase it. A wave of calm washed over him. The decision, once made, settled the frantic chaos in his mind. The temptation of one more time receded, the coiled serpent relaxing back into its dormant state. He took a breath. He knew what he had to do. Aizawa thought he was a one-trick pony, capable of only 100% or nothing. He had to show him the in-between. He gripped the ball, and this time, he didn't try to summon the entire ocean of One for All. He focused, picturing the power not as a wildfire, but as a single drop of water running down a channel. He channeled the immense energy not through his entire arm, but down to a single, focused point, the very tip of his index finger. He felt the power surge, contained and concentrated. It was still immense, still painful, but it was directed. As he threw the ball, he released that power in a single, explosive burst. Smash! He roared, the word torn from his throat. The force of the release was incredible. A shockwave erupted from his fingertip, kicking up a cloud of dust. The ball shot from his hand like a cannonball, a white blur against the blue sky, leaving a visible trail in the air. Pain, sharp and blinding, lanced through his finger. He looked down. His index finger was swollen, purple, and clearly broken. The pain was excruciating, but it was contained. The rest of his arm was fine, his legs were fine. He was still standing. He was still functional. He looked up, panting, and saw Aizawa staring at his device. A slow, wide, and frankly terrifying grin spread across the teacher's face. He turned the device to show the class. 705.3 meters, a tenth of a meter farther than Bakugo. The class gasped. Uraraka and Ida shouted in amazement. Bakugo's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and rage. What the hell was that, Deku? He screamed, explosions popping in his palms. You finally got a quirk and you're still hiding things from me? Izuku clutched his broken finger, hissing in pain but feeling a surge of triumphant relief. He had done it. Aizawa's grin faded back to his usual neutral expression. Good, he said, the single word carrying more weight than 1,000 sentences of praise. You're still not rational, but you're not a complete lost cause. He turned to the rest of the class. Oh, and for the record? The expulsion thing was a logical deception. The class erupted in a mixture of outrage and relief. It was a lie to bring out the best in all of you, Aizawa said with a shrug, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. As the class shuffled back toward the locker rooms, Izuku felt a quiet, profound sense of pride. It was different from the pride he'd felt after the entrance exam. This wasn't a victory born of desperation. It was a victory born of control, of strategic thinking, and of sacrifice. He had willingly accepted the pain of a broken finger to prove his point. He had stared into the abyss of expulsion and refused to take the easy way out. He had saved his quirk. The phantom hum was still there, a full well, a loaded gun. It was his ace in the hole, ready for a day when things were far, far worse than a school test. Later, as Recovery Girl healed his finger with a quick, draining kiss, Aizawa stood in the doorway of the nurse's office. "Midoriya," he said, his tone unreadable. "Why, yes, sir? Your approach was interesting. You contained the self-destructive aspect of your power to a single, non-essential point to maximize output while minimizing liability. It was a surprisingly rational decision for someone who acts on pure emotion." He paused. "Don't make me regret my decision to keep you." He turned and left without another word. Izuku sat on the nurse's bed, the fatigue from Recovery Girl's quirk washing over him. He looked at his hand, his finger now whole but still throbbing with a phantom ache. He had made a calculated risk. He had gambled his entire future on his own ability to grow, rather than on his power to rewind. And he had won. He hadn't erased his failure. He hadn't been perfect. He had been a struggling kid who was in over his head. But he had shown that he could think his way out of a corner. He had shown that he understood the meaning of restraint. And in doing so, he felt more like a hero than ever before. He had passed the test, but the real victory was that he had passed his own test. He had proven to himself that he could carry the weight of his power without letting it carry him. The days following the Quirk apprehension test were a whirlwind of the surreal and the mundane. Izuku's life settled into a new, exhilarating rhythm. There were classes on English with Present Mike, who taught grammar with the same manic energy he used for his radio show, and modern hero art history with Midnight, whose enthusiasm often left the boys in the class flustered and the girls giggling. But the highlight, the class that was the very reason he was here, was Hero Basic Training, and it was taught by All Might. The sheer, unadulterated joy of seeing his idol, in his magnificent Silver Age costume, stride into the classroom was enough to make Izuku's head spin. All Might announced their first real combat training exercise, an indoor, 2-on-2 battle pitting heroes against villains. They would be drawing lots to determine the teams and matchups. Izuku's heart pounded as he reached into the box. He was teamed with Uraraka, the kind girl whose gravity quirk was as powerful as her spirit was bright. A wave of relief washed over him. He knew her, he trusted her, and their quirks didn't seem to clash. Then came the opponent draw. Team D. The moment the letter was called, Izuku felt a familiar dread wash over him. He didn't even need to see who it was. He knew. Of course he knew. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of dramatic irony. He would be facing Bakugo Katsuki. The rivalry between them was a creature of habit, a well-worn path of mockery and fear. But something had shifted since the first day of school. Bakugo's usual sneering dismissal had been replaced by a sharp, analytical glare. He watched Izuku now, not like a pebble to be kicked aside, but like a complex, infuriating puzzle he was determined to solve. The 705.3-meter throw had broken the established order of the universe. Deku, the quirkless, useless Deku, had not only manifested a quirk but had bested him. It was an anomaly Bakugo's pride could not stomach. As they changed into their new hero costumes, Izuku's a green jumpsuit with a slightly too longered cowl that his mother had lovingly made, a tribute to All Might's iconic hair, the tension was a palpable thing. They were assigned their roles. Izuku and Uraraka were the heroes, tasked with retrieving a mock nuclear weapon from the villains, Bakugo and the ever-diligent Ida, who were holed up on the 5th floor of a training building. They stood outside the building, waiting for the signal to start. Uraraka was practically vibrating with excitement. "Wow, your costume is so cool, Deku! Very practical looking." She gave him a thumbs up. "I probably should have been more specific about my design. This suit is so skin-tight, it's a little embarrassing." Izuku, flustered, could barely stammer a compliment back. His mind wasn't on costumes. It was on the predator waiting for them inside. He unfurled a blueprint of the building, his analytical mind kicking into gear as a defense mechanism against the rising tide of fear. "It's a complex layout," he murmured, tracing the corridors with a finger. "Kaken. Bakugo is smart. He's not just a brawler. He'll probably try to ambush us, separate us. He'll come for me, specifically. This is personal for him. It's because you stood up to him, isn't it?" Uraraka asked, her voice soft but perceptive. "That's what's really getting to him." Izuku nodded grimly. The buzzer sounded, signaling the start of the exercise. "Let's go, Uraraka-san." They slipped into the building through a ground-floor window, the air inside cool and stale. The corridors were a maze of gray concrete and exposed pipes. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Izuku's senses were on high alert, his ears straining for the slightest sound. He knew Bakugo wouldn't wait. His pride wouldn't allow for a defensive strategy. He would seek immediate, overwhelming confrontation. They rounded a corner, and there he was. Bakugo launched himself from the shadows without a word, a silent, explosive projectile. His right hand was already sparking. It wasn't a wild attack. It was a precise, targeted strike aimed right at Izuku's head. Izuku reacted on pure instinct, shoving Uraraka out of the way and throwing himself backward. The explosion grazed his mask, searing the side of the cowl and filling the air with the smell of burnt fabric. The concussive force rattled his teeth. "Come on, Deku!" Bakugo snarled, his lips curled back from his teeth in a predatory grin. "Don't dodge. Let's see that fancy new quirk of yours. He ambushed us." "I knew he would," Izuku said to Uraraka through his comms, his voice shaky. "Uraraka-san, go! Find the weapon! I'll try to hold him off, but you'll be on your own," she protested. "He's only after me. This is our best chance." Reluctantly, she nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Now it was just the two of them, standing in the starkly lit corridor, the history of a decade of bullying and resentment hanging between them. The fight was a brutal, one-sided affair. Izuku was on the defensive from the start, using his wits and the building's layout to survive. He couldn't use one for all. A single punch would shatter his arm, ending the exercise and possibly his hero career before it had even begun. Bakugo, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of relentless aggression. He used his explosions not just for attack, but for mobility, blasting himself off walls and ceilings to change his angle of approach with terrifying speed. Izuku dodged, weaved, and blocked, his mind racing. He was using Aizawa's capture weapon, or rather, a cheap knockoff he'd started carrying, to try and bind Bakugo, but his opponent was too fast, too agile. "You've been holding out on me all these years, haven't you?" Bakugo roared, blasting a chunk of wall where Izuku's head had been a second before. "That quirk of yours! You think you're better than me now? You think you can look down on me, you worthless piece of trash? That's not it, Kaken!" Izuku gasped, ducking behind a pillar. "You've always been amazing! That's why I want to beat you. I want to stand on the same stage and win." The confession, raw and honest, only seemed to enrage Bakugo further. "You want to beat me? You!" His gauntlets, the giant, grenade-shaped bracers on his arms, began to glow with an ominous orange light. A high-pitched whine filled the air. "He's been storing his nitroglycerin-like sweat in those gauntlets," Izuku realized, his blood running cold. He remembered the design schematics Bakugo had submitted for his costume. This wasn't just a regular explosion. This was his ultimate move. "Young Bakugo! Don't do it! You'll kill him!" All Might's voice crackled over the intercom from the observation room. Bakugo's grin was manic. "He won't die if he dodges!" He aimed the gauntlet, not at Izuku directly, but at the wall beside him. He pulled the pin. The world erupted in a cataclysm of fire and force. The explosion was on a scale Izuku couldn't have imagined. It didn't just blast a hole in the wall. It tore a massive, gaping wound through the entire side of the building. The floor buckled, the ceiling cracked, and a wave of superheated air and shrapnel blasted Izuku off his feet. He was thrown against the far wall like a ragdoll. The impact was sickening, a full-body crack of bone and cartilage. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded through him. He couldn't breathe. His ears were ringing with a deafening, high-pitched tone. His vision was a blurry, swimming mess of gray and red. Through the haze, he saw Uraraka. The blast had exposed her hiding spot on the floor above. Debris was raining down around her. She was vulnerable, terrified. He saw Bakugo, shrouded in smoke, stepping through the hole he'd created, his face a mask of shocked triumph. He hadn't expected the blast to be so powerful. They had lost. Utterly and completely. Izuku was incapacitated, Uraraka was exposed, and Ida would have no trouble defending the weapon now. Lying in the rubble, the taste of blood and concrete dust in his mouth, Izuku felt a surge of cold, desperate fury. Not at Bakugo. At himself. He had failed. He had let his partner down. He had been weak. He had been outmaneuvered. The familiar, desperate thought ignited in the core of his being, a flicker of defiance against the crushing pain. No. I can do better. Let me do this again. From the beginning of the fight, his will latched onto the memory of that first ambush, the moment Bakugo had launched himself from the shadows. That was the start point. Let me do it right. The universe twisted. The pain vanished, replaced by a nauseating, full-body vertigo. The roar of the explosion compressed into a single, piercing shriek that vibrated in his bones. The world dissolved into a smear of color and light, a film reel being violently rewound. He felt the phantom agony of his broken ribs, the ghost of the searing heat on his skin, the memory of the impact against the wall. The psychological whiplash was staggering, and then it stopped. He was standing in the corridor, Uraraka at his side. The air was cool and still. The walls were intact. His body was whole. But the memory of his brutal defeat was branded onto his soul. The migraine that followed every use of one more time was already blooming behind his eyes, a dull, pounding ache that promised to grow into a monster. He had rewound the last 5 minutes. 5 minutes of pain and failure, now existing only in his head. Deku? Are you okay? Uraraka asked, noticing the flicker of disorientation in his eyes. You look pale. He took a shaky breath, his mind racing, processing the impossible knowledge he now possessed. He knew Bakugo's every move. He knew the timing of his attacks, the arc of his explosions, his patterns of movement. He knew the raw, wounded pride that was driving him, and he knew, with chilling certainty, about the devastating power of his gauntlets. He had seen the future. Now, he had to rewrite it. I'm fine, he said, his voice steady despite the hammer in his skull. Change of plan. Stick with me. Don't leave. Before Uraraka could question him, a shadow moved at the end of the hall. Bakugo launched himself from the corner, a perfect mirror of the first timeline. But this time, Izuku was ready. Instead of shoving Uraraka and dodging backward, he moved forward. He grabbed Uraraka's arm and pulled her with him, ducking low and to the left. The explosion from Bakugo's palm went off exactly where they had been standing, scorching the air with a harmless FOM. Bakugo landed, his eyes wide with surprise. His ambush, so perfectly timed, had been sidestepped with an ease that shouldn't have been possible. How? He started to say. Now Uraraka-san! Izuku yelled. He didn't need to explain. They had discussed contingencies. Uraraka slapped her hand on the pillar beside Bakugo, activating her quirk. Release! She cried, and a large chunk of concrete floated into the air. It was a simple distraction, but combined with Izuku's preternatural dodge, it threw Bakugo completely off balance. We're going up! Izuku said, already running for the stairwell. This was his new plan. In the first timeline, he had allowed himself to be isolated, to be drawn into a one-on-one fight he couldn't win. This time, he would use Bakugo's aggression against him. He would lead him on a chase, forcing him to expend energy and, more importantly, sweat, while Uraraka went for the objective. The battle that followed was a deadly, intricate dance. Izuku was no longer just reacting. He was anticipating. He was a ghost from the future, moving in perfect counterpoint to a past he had already witnessed. He led Bakugo through the labyrinthine corridors, his movements precise and economical. He knew that Bakugo would use a right hook after a left-sided explosion. He knew he would use the floor for a ricochet blast in the wider hallways. He dodged attacks that hadn't even been launched yet, sidestepping explosions with a calm that infuriated his opponent. To Bakugo, it was maddening. It was like Izuku could read his mind. Every feint was seen through, every surprise attack was met with a prepared counter-dodge. He was fighting a ghost. Stand still and fight me, DKU! Bakugo raged, his movements growing more frantic, more reckless. His carefully controlled fury was devolving into pure, unadulterated rage. He was making mistakes. Meanwhile, Izuku was feeding Uraraka information through the comms. He's distracted. Get to the 4th floor. Ida should have cleared out the main room to make it a fortress. Look for a secondary access point, maybe a maintenance hatch on the western wall. How do you know that? Uraraka's voice came back, laced with awe and confusion. Just a hunch. Izuku lied, his head throbbing. Finally, on the fourth floor, Bakugo cornered him. He was panting, sweat pouring down his face, his eyes wild. He raised his gauntlet. The familiar, high-pitched whine began to fill the air. I'm tired of this, Bakugo growled. You've been running, dodging, treating me like a fool. Whatever cheap trick you're using, it ends now. This was the moment. Izuku had been leading him here. He had seen the catastrophic power of this weapon. Now, he had to disarm it. Kaken, don't! Izuku said, his voice calm, projecting a confidence he didn't feel. All Might already told you not to use that. It's against the rules of the exercise. You'll be disqualified. You'll lose. Shut up! Bakugo roared, but for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. The threat of an automatic loss, a failure on his permanent record, was a potent one. Izuku pressed his advantage, using the knowledge from the first timeline. Think about it, Kaken. Your quirk is amazing. You're strong. You don't need a cheap shot like that to win. You want to beat me, right? Then beat me. Not just the building. He was appealing to the one thing more powerful than Bakugo's rage, his pride. The idea that using his ultimate weapon was a cheap shot was an insult he couldn't ignore. Bakugo hesitated, his finger hovering over the pin. And in that moment of hesitation, Izuku acted. He threw a roll of his capture weapon, not at Bakugo, but at the ceiling above him. The tape snagged on an exposed water pipe. He used it to swing, not away, but directly toward Bakugo. It was the last thing Bakugo expected. Izuku crashed into him, a tangle of limbs. He didn't use one for all. He didn't need to. He just used his momentum and his knowledge of Bakugo's stance to throw him off balance. As they fell, Izuku's hand shot out and slapped the emergency release valve on the side of the gauntlet. With a hiss, the stored nitroglycerin sweat vented out harmlessly onto the floor, a puddle of volatile goo. The weapon was neutralized. At that exact moment, Uraraka's voice came over the comms, triumphant. I've got it! I touched the weapon! A loud buzzer echoed through the building. Hero team wins! Silence. Izuku lay on the floor, tangled up with a stunned Bakugo, his entire body trembling with adrenaline and the pounding agony in his skull. They had won. He had rewritten their failure into a flawless victory. He pushed himself up, his legs shaky. Bakugo remained on the floor, staring at the ceiling, his expression utterly blank. The rage was gone, replaced by a hollow, profound confusion. They were escorted to the observation room, where the rest of the class was waiting. All Might was there, his usual booming persona replaced by a look of deep, analytical thought. The class erupted in questions and praise for Izuku and Uraraka. Midoriya, that was amazing! Kirishima exclaimed. Your dodging was insane! It was like you knew what he was going to do before he did, and the way you coordinated with Uraraka-san was flawless! Yayorozu added, looking impressed. Your strategic acumen is incredible. Izuku could only offer a weak, tired smile. He felt dizzy, the edges of his vision starting to swim. The migraine was reaching its crescendo, but his attention was on Bakugo, who stood apart from the group, silent and withdrawn. He hadn't said a word. He was replaying the fight in his head, trying to make sense of the impossible, trying to understand how Deku, the clumsy, crying, worthless Deku, had outthought him, outmaneuvered him, and predicted his every move with supernatural precision. Later, as they were walking out of the school building, the adrenaline having faded, leaving only exhaustion in its wake, Bakugo finally confronted him. He cornered him near the school gates, away from the others. His voice was quiet, dangerously so. It was more unsettling than his usual yelling. How? He asked, his crimson eyes boring into Izuku's. Don't give me any crap about hunches or getting lucky. I've known you my whole life. You're clumsy. You're hesitant. But in there, you weren't. You moved before I did. You knew about my gauntlets. You knew exactly what to say to make me hesitate. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It felt like you'd fought me before. Like you already knew how you were going to lose, so you did something else. Izuku's blood ran cold. He had come so close. He had come so terrifyingly close to the truth. The idea was so outlandish that no sane person would ever jump to it. But Bakugo's pride had been so wounded, his worldview so shattered, that he was reaching for the impossible to explain it. Izuku's mind raced, his throbbing head making it hard to think. He couldn't tell the truth. But a simple denial wouldn't work. He needed something else. He fell back on the half-truth All Might had unknowingly provided him. I don't know how to explain it, Kakin, he said, his voice trembling slightly, which wasn't an act. My quirk, it's not just strength. Sometimes, when I'm in danger, I get these flashes. These feelings, like a really strong sense of déjà vu. I just knew what you were going to do. I can't control it. It just happens. It was a lie, but it was a lie wrapped in a plausible quirk-based explanation. A hyperinstinct. A precognitive flash. In a world of people who could talk to animals or shoot tape from their elbows, it wasn't that far-fetched. Bakugo stared at him for a long, tense moment. He was searching Izuku's face, looking for any sign of deception. He was clearly unconvinced, but he had no other explanation. The alternative, that Deku was lying, was infuriating, but the idea that this new, strange quirk was the cause was a possibility his logical mind could, however grudgingly, entertain. You're still hiding something. Bakugo finally growled, but the sharp edge of his certainty was gone, replaced by a grudging, frustrated confusion. He shoved past Izuku, his shoulder bumping him hard. This isn't over, Deku. Not by a long shot. He stalked off, leaving Izuku leaning against the school wall, his legs feeling like jelly. The lie had worked for now. But it had planted a new seed in their rivalry. It was no longer just about strength, or who was better. It was about a secret. A mystery that Bakugo was now determined to solve. Izuku closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his palms against his throbbing temples. He had won. He had protected his partner, and achieved the objective with minimal damage. But the victory felt tainted. It wasn't entirely his. It belonged to the ghost of the boy who had been broken and defeated in the first timeline. He carried the memory of that failure, the phantom pain of the blast, the suffocating feeling of defeat. This power, he was learning, created echoes. Every time he used it, he left a ghost behind, a memory of a failure only he could see. And it created ripples in the present, suspicions and questions that he had to navigate with clumsy lies. He had won the battle, but he was creating a whole new kind of war with his oldest rival, one based on a truth that could never be spoken. The rescue of All Might from the press horde, the election of Ada as class president, the sheer, giddy normalcy of it all. It was a balm to Izuku's frayed nerves. For a few precious days, the weight of his secret quirks seemed to lighten. He was just a high school student, learning about heroes, laughing with his new friends, Uraraka and Ida. The phantom thrum of One More Time was a quiet companion, its well full and undisturbed, a silent promise of a power he hoped he would never have to use again. The memory of the battle trial had faded from a raw, throbbing wound to a dull, scar tissue ache. He was beginning to believe, foolishly, that perhaps things could be simple. The trip to the unforeseen simulation joint, or USJ, was supposed to be the pinnacle of this newfound normalcy. A chance to practice rescue operations in a controlled environment under the supervision of Aizawa, All Might, and the space hero, 13. The bus ride was filled with the loud, boisterous energy of Class 1A. Kirishima was trying to goad Bakugo into a conversation about manliness, Kaminari was joking about his quirk, and Tsuyu Ezuri was, with her characteristic bluntness, telling Izuku that his power was a lot like All Might's. The comment sent a jolt of panic through him, but Kirishima's good-natured dismissal of the idea as impossible quickly smoothed it over. Izuku felt a pang of guilt. He was living a life built on layers of deception, the secret of One for All, and buried even deeper, the secret of One More Time. He looked out the window, watching the city blur by, feeling a familiar sense of isolation even while surrounded by his friends. The USJ itself was a marvel, a colossal dome containing perfect replicas of a dozen different disaster zones, a shipwreck, a landslide, a conflagration, a flood. 13 was explaining the dangers of their quirks, how a power designed to save could just as easily kill, when the world went wrong. It started subtly. The lights flickered and died, plunging the massive dome into an eerie twilight, illuminated only by the emergency lamps and the simulated fires. Then, the fountain at the center of the facility sputtered, its water surging unnaturally. A dark, swirling vortex of purple and black mist began to coalesce in front of it. It was like a wound opening in the fabric of reality. "Whoa, has the training started already?" Kirishima asked, his usual enthusiasm tinged with confusion. "I thought we were just getting the introduction." Aizawa's reaction was instant and chilling. His entire demeanor shifted from tired apathy to razor-sharp focus. "Stay back," he commanded, pulling his yellow goggles over his eyes. "This is real. Those are villains." From the dark portal, figures began to emerge. Dozens of them. They were a motley collection of thugs and lowlifes, their faces twisted into sneers and manic grins. But two figures drew the eye. One was a man made of the same purple mist as the portal, his form vaguely humanoid, with glowing yellow slits for eyes. The other was a man who seemed to scratch compulsively at his neck, his lanky frame draped in black. His shaggy, light blue hair obscured his face, but what was visible was covered in hands. Disembodied, preserved hands gripping his arms, his shoulders, his head. "The only real heroes I see are 13 and Eraserhead," the hand-covered man rasped, his voice a dry, scratchy sound that grated on the nerves. "Perplexing. According to the schedule we procured, All Might was supposed to be here today. They had inside information. They had come here to kill All Might." The bottom dropped out of Izuku's stomach. This wasn't a test. This wasn't a drill. This was an invasion. A full-scale, organized attack by a league of villains. Panic, cold and suffocating, threatened to overwhelm him. He could feel the familiar, instinctual urge to reach for his safety net, to rewind time back to the bus, to warn them, to stop this before it began. But he fought it down. This was happening now. The crisis was here. This was what he had been saving his power for. He couldn't waste it on a simple reset. He had to wait. He had to be rational. Aizawa didn't hesitate. 13, protect the students. Kaminari, try to get a signal out. The rest of you, stay put. With that, he leaped into the fray, his capture weapon lashing out like living serpents. He was a whirlwind of controlled chaos, erasing quirks and using his incredible martial arts skills to disable villain after villain. He was magnificent. He was one man against 100, but the students weren't safe for long. The man made of mist, Kurojairi, blocked their escape. "I will not allow you to leave," he said, his voice a polite, terrifying baritone. "My role is to scatter you and torture you to death." His misty form expanded, engulfing them. Izuku felt a sense of vertigo, a feeling of being pulled apart and reassembled. For a horrifying moment, he thought he'd accidentally activated his own quirk. He was falling, tumbling through a purple void, before he splashed down into cold water. He surfaced, gasping, in the shipwreck zone. The water was choppy, and a large, villain-infested ship loomed over him. He wasn't alone. Tsuyu Ajiri and Mineta Minoru, the small, grape-haired boy, surfaced nearby. "This is bad, Kero," Tsuyu said, her frog-like calm a stark contrast to Mineta's hysterical screaming. The villains in the water, a collection of thugs with aquatic quirks, began to close in, their faces split in predatory grins. This was a contained crisis, a microcosm of the larger battle. Izuku's mind went into analytical mode. He saw Tsuyu's abilities, Mineta's strange but potentially useful quirk, and the weaknesses of their opponents. He formulated a plan. "Listen to me," he yelled, taking charge. "Their quirks are suited for the water, but they don't know what our quirks are. They're hesitating. We can use that." With a combination of his own tactical thinking, Tsuyu's incredible mobility, and Mineta's sticky grape spheres, they created a vortex, pulling all the waterborne villains into a helpless, struggling mass. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. They had survived. They made their way to the shore, their adrenaline still pumping. From their vantage point, they could see the main plaza. And what they saw was a nightmare. Aizawa was still fighting, but he was slowing down. His hair was dropping periodically, a sign that he was having to blink, giving the villains brief windows to use their quirks, and he was no longer fighting the grunts. He was engaged with the man with the hands, Shigaraki Tamura, but the true horror was the creature at Shigaraki's side. It was a monster. A hulking behemoth of dark purple muscle, its brain exposed, its eyes vacant and staring. Its beak-like mouth was twisted into a grotesque, permanent grin. It was built like All Might, but it was a twisted, nightmarish perversion of his form. Nomu! Shigaraki cackled, scratching his neck with a feverish intensity. Kill him! The creature, the Nomu, moved with a speed that defied its massive size. It caught Aizawa's punch, then his other arm. There was a sickening series of cracks as it broke both his arms as if they were twigs. Then it grabbed his head and slammed it into the concrete. Once. Twice. The sound was a wet, percussive thud that made Izuku feel physically ill. No! Izuku whispered, his body frozen in horror. He was watching his teacher being murdered. Shigaraki laughed, a high-pitched, unhinged sound. You're so cool, Eraserhead. So cool. He turned, his gaze sweeping the area, and his red eyes landed on their small group at the edge of the water. His smile widened. He began to move toward them, his steps unhurried, almost casual. Let's see. Shigaraki mused, his scratchy voice carrying across the plaza. Before All Might gets here and the final boss fight begins, maybe I should smash some of his students' pride. He was coming for them. For Tsuyu. For Mineta. For him. The paralysis that had gripped Izuku shattered, replaced by a surge of pure, ice-cold terror. This was it. The moment of truth. Aizawa was being beaten to death by the monster. Shigaraki was coming to kill them. This was the unwinnable scenario. His mind fractured into a dozen different possibilities, each one a pathway to failure. The power of one more time surged within him, a roaring inferno demanding to be used. The well was full, the trigger was primed. He had one shot. One chance to rewind. But to when? Option 1, rewind 30 seconds. He could warn Tsuyu and Mineta about Shigaraki's approach. They could try to flee to hide. But what about Aizawa? In those 30 seconds the Nomu would still be smashing his head into the pavement. He might save his friends only to ensure his teacher's death. The image of Aizawa's broken, bloody form was seared into his brain. He couldn't let that happen. Option 2, rewind a full minute. Go back to before the Nomu attacked Aizawa. He could scream a warning. Aizawa-sensei! The big one! It's too strong! Maybe Aizawa could evade. Maybe he could retreat, but that would leave the monster free. What would it do then? Attack the other students? And while Aizawa was potentially saved, that would leave Shigaraki free to walk right over to them, unimpeded. He would be trading one victim for another. Option 3, a strategic intervention. Maybe he could rewind just 10 seconds. He could use One for All, leap from his position, and try to intercept Shigaraki before he reached Tsuyu. A 5% smash might be enough to knock him off balance, to buy them a few precious seconds. But that would be a gamble. He would be revealing himself, using his trump card, and the Nomu was still there, a horrifying, unstoppable force. If he failed, they would all die. His mind was a maelstrom of choices, a frantic, desperate calculation of risk and reward. Each path he envisioned was flawed, each one leading to a different, equally horrific outcome. He saw Tsuyu's face disintegrating under Shigaraki's hand. He saw Aizawa's skull cracking under the Nomu's fist. He saw himself, broken and bleeding, having failed to save anyone. The perfect moment to intervene, the single, flawless strategic rewind that would solve everything, didn't exist. There was no clean solution. There was no right answer. There was only a choice between different kinds of failure, and he was paralyzed. The weight of the decision was a physical thing, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He was a god for a single second, with the power to rewrite a sliver of history, and the responsibility was crushing him. He was so terrified of making the wrong choice that he couldn't make any choice at all. He watched, a helpless spectator to a tragedy he felt he could prevent, as the two scenarios played out simultaneously. The Nomu raised Aizawa's head for another devastating blow. Shigaraki's hand, his fingers splayed, reached for Tsuyu's face. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the terror in Tsuyu's wide eyes. He saw the blood matting Aizawa's black hair. Do something! A part of his brain screamed. Anything! The paralysis broke. The fear of inaction finally became greater than the fear of making the wrong choice. But it was too late for a strategic rewind. The moment had passed. His hesitation had cost him his ultimate weapon. There was no time to think, no time to plan. There was only time to act. He abandoned the idea of using one more time. It was too late. He had to rely on himself. He burst from the tree line, a green blur of motion. He channeled one for all into his legs and leaped, covering the distance to the plaza in a single, desperate bound. He was aiming for Shigaraki, a kamikaze missile of pure heroic instinct. Get away from her! He roared. He drew back his fist, channeling the power of one for all. Smash! He didn't aim for Shigaraki himself. He aimed for the water in front of him, mimicking All Might's wind pressure attacks. A massive shockwave erupted, a concussive blast of air and water that threw Shigaraki off balance, forcing him back from Tsuyu. Izuku landed hard, his legs screaming in protest from the uncontrolled power. He had saved Tsuyu. For now. But as he looked up, panting, he saw the price of his choice. While he had been focused on Shigaraki, the Noma had not stopped. It had slammed Aizawa's head into the ground one final, sickening time. Their teacher now lay in a broken, unmoving heap. Shigaraki stumbled back, looking at Izuku with a newfound interest. Oh? You're fast. And powerful. But not as powerful as All Might. He turned to the Noma. Noma! Get him! The monster dropped Aizawa's limp body and turned its vacant, beady eyes on Izuku. It was on him in an instant, its massive fist swinging. Izuku was too slow, too exhausted, too off balance to dodge. The punch never landed. The doors to the USJ burst open with a cataclysmic bang, blasted off their hinges. A figure stood silhouetted against the daylight, his face a mask of incandescent fury. It's fine now. All Might's voice boomed, but it was devoid of its usual cheer. It was a low, terrifying rumble of pure rage. I am here, but he was smiling. Izuku knew that smile. It wasn't for the villains. It was for the students. A beacon of reassurance in the face of terror. The battle that followed was on a scale Izuku could scarcely comprehend. It was a clash of titans, a maelstrom of shockwaves that tore the plaza apart. All Might was incredible, but the Nomu was his perfect counter, possessing both shock absorption and super regeneration. It could withstand his most powerful punches. Izuku could only watch, a useless bystander, clutching Tsuyu and Mineta and pulling them back toward the entrance where the other students were gathering. He watched as All Might began to weaken, his time limit clearly pushing its breaking point. He watched as his hero, his mentor, began to lose, and the guilt was a physical sickness in his gut. I could have done something, the thought screamed at him, a merciless internal chorus. I had the power. I had one perfect, beautiful chance to change things, and I froze. If he had been faster, if he hadn't hesitated, could he have found a better way? Could he have rewound and created an opening for Aizawa to escape? Could he have used his knowledge to create a distraction that would have saved him and his friends? He would never know. His paralysis, born from the overwhelming burden of choice, had been the worst choice of all. He had done nothing. And now Aizawa was lying near death, and All Might was being pushed to his absolute limit. The tide of the battle turned when Kirishima, Bakugo, and Todoroki joined the fray, their combined, surprise assault giving All Might a precious few seconds of breathing room. It was enough. You may have heard these words before. All Might roared, his body radiating an impossible amount of power. But I'll teach you what they really mean. He launched a furious volley of punches, each one faster and stronger than the last. Go beyond! Plus ultra! His final punch was a thing of terrible beauty, a blow so powerful it sent the Noma flying out of the USJ dome and into the stratosphere. The resulting wind pressure was a hurricane that nearly blew everyone off their feet. The battle was over. The remaining villains, including a wounded Shigaraki and Kurojairi, retreated through a portal just as the other pro-heroes arrived. The aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos. Medics were tending to the wounded. 13 was seriously injured. Aizawa was being carefully loaded onto a stretcher, his body broken, his face a swollen, bloody mess. He was alive, but barely. Izuku stood with Uraraka and the others, wrapped in a shock blanket, his body trembling. He watched his teacher being carried away, and the guilt was a suffocating shroud. He had a godlike power in his pocket, and in the moment it mattered most, he had been nothing more than a scared, indecisive child. He had failed the ultimate test. He had the power to replay any moment. But what good was a second chance if you were too afraid to take the first? He had saved his power for the perfect moment, but when faced with an imperfect, messy, and terrifying reality, he had discovered a horrifying truth. There was no such thing as a perfect moment. There were only hard choices and their devastating consequences. He had wanted to be a hero who could save everyone. But today, he had learned the hero's most brutal lesson. He couldn't. And his quirk, his secret weapon, had only served to amplify his failure, showing him the ghosts of all the things he might have done, if only he had been brave enough to choose.